She had no idea the man across that diner had already changed the entire direction of her life once before come, without ever using his real name. She'd driven 3 hours with no destination, just to remember what it felt like to be nobody for one afternoon. "Can I sit with you?" 4 words. That's all it took to start the strangest, most impossible coincidence of both our lives.
Can I sit with you?
Go ahead. One phrase from an old case file. That's all it took for 10 years of careful secrecy to start unraveling. You've spent 9 years looking. I've spent 9 years hiding. This is yours.
No, it can't be you.
The bell over the door of the Copper Kettle Diner chimed at exactly 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, and a woman I had never met in my life walked in soaked from the rain, scanned a completely full dining room, and asked if she could sit with me and my 7-year-old daughter. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease and wet umbrellas propped in the corner by the door, and every booth along the window was fogged with condensation from the rain outside. The kind of small-town Tuesday that never once suggested anything unusual was about to happen. I said of course, mostly because it seemed cruel to say anything else to someone who looked that tired, and because Mia had already scooted over in the booth to make room before I'd even finished answering. I had absolutely no idea, sliding my coffee cup 6 inches to the left to make space for hers, that the woman lowering herself into the seat across from me had been, for the better part of a decade, the single most important stranger in my entire life. Someone I had thought about more often than most of my actual friends. Someone whose handwritten essay I could still recite pieces of from memory. Someone I had helped save from the very edge of giving up on herself, without her ever learning my name. I found out who she really was about 40 minutes later, in the middle of an ordinary conversation about pie. And by the time I understood what had actually just walked through that door, neither one of us was ever going to see that Tuesday the same way again. But to understand exactly how a plumber's daughter from 3 states over could end up sitting across from me at a diner without either of us knowing the truth, you need to go back 9 years to a stack of anonymous applications on my kitchen table and a promise I made to my wife before she died. If you've ever wondered whether the good things you do quietly, without credit, without anyone ever knowing your name, actually matter in the end, stay with me until the very last minute of this story, because I got my answer, and it walked through a diner door in the rain. My name is Ryan Coleman, and for most of my adult life, almost nobody outside one very careful lawyer knew the full truth about where my family's money actually came from, or what I quietly did with most of it. My father built a small furniture manufacturing company from a single rented garage in the 1980s, the kind of business that grows slowly and honestly over 30 years instead of exploding overnight. And by the time he passed the company to me in my late 20s, it had become successful enough that selling it, a few years later, to a larger furniture group left me with more money than I ever expected to have in one lifetime. My father used to say the company survived its first 5 years purely out of stubbornness, building custom cabinetry for anyone who'd pay him fairly, and refusing every offer to cut corners on materials even when cutting corners would have kept the lights on. I grew up sanding table legs in that garage before I was tall enough to reach the workbench without a step stool, and some of my earliest memories are the specific smell of sawdust and wood glue, a smell I still can't separate from the idea of home. I kept a small workshop for myself out of what remained after the sale, restoring old furniture mostly, because I liked working with my hands and I liked that nobody who dropped off a scratched dining table ever asked what my net worth was. To almost everyone in Riverbend, I was just Ryan, the guy who could fix your grandmother's rocking chair and coached rec league soccer badly but enthusiastically on Saturday mornings. I met my wife, Claire, 2 years after selling the company, at a fundraiser for the same community college she'd attended on a patchwork of grants and part-time jobs. She had the specific, unshakable conviction of someone who had needed help once and never forgotten exactly how it felt. And she believed, more firmly than anyone I've ever known, that the purest form of generosity was the kind that never asked to be thanked. The second someone has to know your name, she told me once, very early in our relationship, It stops being a gift and starts being a transaction. I didn't fully understand what she meant until years later, but I married her partly because of how completely she meant it. She used to tell people, only half joking, that she'd married me for my hands rather than my bank account, because she'd fallen for me months before she ever learned the full extent of what selling my father's company had actually left me with. And by the time she did find out, she said it didn't change a single thing about how she already felt, which was, I think, exactly the point she'd been trying to make about money never being the actual foundation of anything worth keeping. We had Mia when I was 36, and for a while our life together was exactly as ordinary and golden as I'd always hoped. Sunday pancakes, sawdust tracked through the kitchen no matter how many times I promised to leave my boots at the door. Claire humming half-remembered song lyrics while she folded laundry. 18 months after Mia was born, Claire was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and 11 months after that, I was a 37-year-old widower trying to figure out how to braid a toddler's hair from a video tutorial at midnight, the same way I imagine every single parent in this particular kind of story eventually has to learn. The first year without her is mostly a blur of casseroles from neighbors and learning, badly, how to manage a toddler's entire emotional world on my own. But somewhere in the second year, once the sharpest edge of the grief had dulled into something more like a permanent low hum, I found myself needing a project that felt like it belonged to both of us instead of just to my own private sorrow. In the last few months of her illness, Claire and I had spent a lot of quiet evenings talking about what we wanted to do with the money neither of us had ever needed to spend on ourselves. She didn't want a building with our name on it. She didn't want a scholarship with a plaque. She wanted something simpler and, in its own way, much harder. A fund that would find people standing at the exact edge of giving up on something worth saving, and hand them one real, no-strings-attached chance to keep going, without ever telling them who had given it to them. "Let them think the universe did it," she said, smiling even though she was too tired by then to smile for long. "Let them go be brilliant and never once feel like they owe somebody a thank you speech." I promised her I would build it, and 6 months after the funeral, working with a discreet estate attorney named Grant Ellison, I did. We called it the Second Chance Fund, structured it as a private grant program with no public office, no website beyond a single unlisted application portal, and no name attached anywhere a recipient could ever trace back to me. It became that project, and some nights, working through applications at the kitchen table, it was the closest thing I had to still talking to her. Grant reviewed every application for basic eligibility and forwarded the finalists to me, stripped of anything identifying beyond the essay itself, and I made the actual funding decisions alone, usually late at night after Mia was asleep, at the same kitchen table where Claire and I had first sketched out the idea on a napkin. I want to be honest that reading those applications became, for me, something closer to a form of grief therapy than an act of charity. There is a particular, unglamorous kind of desperation in the way people write when they genuinely believe no one is going to read it closely enough to actually help. A raw, unpolished honesty you don't find in resumes or scholarship essays designed to impress a committee. I read hundreds of them over the years. Over the years, the fund helped a single mother finish her paramedic certification, a laid-off machinist retrain as an electrician in his 50s. A 19-year-old covered the deposit on his first apartment after aging out of a group home with nowhere else to go. Each file taught me something different about the specific, quiet moment right before someone either keeps going or doesn't, and I never stopped being amazed by how small an amount of money, given at exactly the right week of someone's life, could change absolutely everything that came after it. Most I couldn't fund, simply because the fund, however generous, wasn't infinite. But there was one particular application, 9 years ago now, that I still remember almost word for word, from a 25-year-old woman named Olivia Hart. She'd aged out of the foster care system at 18 with nothing beyond a single duffel bag and a fierce, almost defensive determination to build a life nobody could ever take away from her again. She was working 2 jobs, a diner shift in the mornings, a stockroom shift at night, while attending community college part-time, one semester away from either finishing her associate's degree or dropping out entirely because the math simply didn't work anymore. In the margins of an otherwise straightforward financial need essay, almost as an aside, she'd written about a tiny skincare line she'd started mixing in her apartment kitchen using ingredients she could actually afford, selling small batches to coworkers and neighbors, convinced, with the specific, stubborn conviction of someone who has had to be her own only advocate for her entire life, that it could become something real if she just had enough runway to stop choosing between rent and ingredients every single month. She'd written, in one particular line I still remember precisely, that she wasn't asking anyone to believe her idea was good, only asking for enough time to find out for herself whether it was, because nobody in her entire life up to that point had ever given her the room to fail on her own terms instead of someone else's. I've read a lot of applications since then, but I don't think any single sentence has stayed with me as long as that one. I read that essay twice, then a third time, then walked outside into the backyard at 11 at night and sat on the porch steps for a long while, because something about her handwriting, honest almost to the point of not caring how it looked, reminded me powerfully of Claire. I approved full funding for her remaining tuition and added, on my own initiative, a modest business grant on top of it. Enough seed money to properly launch what she'd been mixing in her kitchen, structured as a grant rather than a loan. At Grant's gentle suggestion that a woman who'd spent her whole life owing people things deserved, at least once, to receive something with absolutely no repayment attached. The fund's only ongoing condition, standard across every recipient, was a brief annual update letter to Grant's office, meant to help us understand whether the model was actually working. Olivia's first update, 8 months later, mentioned she'd finished her degree and that the small skincare line had a real name now, Heart Wellness, and an actual, if tiny, customer base beyond her apartment building. I kept every one of her letters after that, not because the fund required me to, but because I genuinely wanted to know what happened to her. The letters got longer, then shorter again, as the business apparently got busier. Somewhere around year 3, she mentioned hiring her first employee. I remember exactly where I was the day her 5th-year letter arrived, because it was the same week Mia lost her first tooth, and I sat at the kitchen table that evening reading about Heart Wellness opening its first real office space while Mia proudly displayed a gap in her smile. 2 completely unrelated milestones somehow landing on the same ordinary Tuesday. And I remember thinking, with a small private kind of pride I never got to share with anyone, that both of my girls, in very different ways, were growing into exactly who they were meant to be. By year 7, I didn't need her letters to know how she was doing anymore, because Heart Wellness had become successful enough that I occasionally saw her name mentioned in the same trade publications I skimmed for furniture industry news, always with the same detail repeated in nearly every profile, that the company's origin story remained, by the founder's own account, a mystery even to me. Someone helped me once when I had nothing, and I never learned who. I never told anyone that someone was me. I never even told Grant how closely I tracked her progress, though I suspect, given how thorough he is, he knew anyway. It wasn't modesty exactly, or at least not only modesty. It was Claire's rule, the one she'd made me promise before she died. The moment a gift needs your name attached to it, it stops being a gift. I'd kept that promise faithfully for 9 years, through dozens of other recipients whose stories I never followed as closely, and I fully intended to keep it for the rest of my life. I had absolutely no plan, and no reason to expect, that a rainstorm in Riverbend was going to make that promise a great deal more complicated. Which brings us back to that Tuesday. Mia and I had ducked into the copper kettle for grilled cheese and tomato soup after her dentist appointment. The diner unusually packed for early afternoon, because half of Main Street had apparently had the same idea about waiting out the storm somewhere warm and dry. I noticed the woman the moment the bell over the door chimed, mostly because she looked the way people look when they've been driving with no particular destination for longer than they meant to. Damp, unhurried in a way that seemed deliberate, scanning the room with the specific weariness of someone hoping, just for an hour, not to be recognized by anyone at all. She wasn't. Nobody in that diner had any idea Olivia Hart, founder and CEO of a company now valued somewhere in the billions, had just walked in wearing a plain trench coat with her sunglasses fogged from the rain, because nothing about her deliberately gave it away. "Sorry," she said, gesturing at the one open half of our booth once every other table had confirmed itself full. "Would you mind? I promise I don't bite." Mia, who has never once in her life met a stranger she didn't immediately try to befriend, slid over before I'd even opened my mouth and announced, with complete 7-year-old confidence, that the grilled cheese here was the best in the entire world, probably, which earned the first real smile I'd see cross Olivia's face all afternoon. We fell into the kind of easy, meandering conversation that strangers sometimes manage precisely because they know they'll never see each other again. No performance, no networking angle, nothing at stake. She asked Mia what the best thing about Riverbend was, and Mia, without missing a beat, said the ice cream shop, but only on Fridays because that's the only day they do the good sprinkles, which earned an actual unguarded laugh from Olivia, the first one I'd see all afternoon that didn't look like it cost her something. We talked about nothing important for a while after that. The rain, a terrible cover band she'd once seen at a wedding, the correct ratio of grilled cheese crust to filling, a topic Mia had extremely strong opinions about. She told us, in careful generalities, that she worked in wellness products, that she'd driven out from the city that morning with no real plan beyond wanting to be somewhere nobody needed anything from her for a few hours. I told her about the workshop, about Mia's ongoing campaign to get a dog, about being a widower, a fact I mentioned plainly, the way I've learned to over the years, without turning it into a heavier moment than the conversation called for. She listened in a way that felt genuinely present rather than polite, and at some point, without either of us really deciding to get personal, she mentioned, almost offhand, stirring her coffee, that she'd almost dropped out of college once, a long time ago, before someone she'd never met stepped in. "Some private fund," she said, staring into her cup rather than at me, in the particular tone people use for the one story they've told 100 times and still can't quite believe happened to them. No interview, no committee, nothing. Just a letter that said more or less that they believed the plan I'd written down was worth backing, and that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for needing help. I've spent actual money, private investigators at one point, which sounds insane saying out loud, trying to find out who was behind it, just so I could say thank you properly. Never got anywhere. Whoever it was covered their tracks completely. I want to tell you I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I did not. Something in my face must have shifted because Mia, oblivious to any of the actual stakes of the conversation, asked Olivia what the letter had said exactly, and Olivia, laughing a little at herself, said she still had the original tucked in her wallet, an old habit she'd never managed to break, and recited a line from it that I recognized instantly, word for word, because I had personally approved the language grants office used on every single second chance fund letter for the past 9 years. That the fund existed to give people one real chance, no strings, no name attached, no debt owed to anyone but their own future. I had written that exact sentence myself at our kitchen table in the 3rd month after Claire died. My phone rang at that moment, which felt, later, like either terrible or perfect timing depending on how you look at it. I almost didn't step outside to take the call at all, nearly told Grant I'd phone him back after lunch, and I still don't fully understand what made me answer it right then instead of an hour later. It was Grant, calling about an entirely unrelated piece of fund business, a routine question about an upcoming disbursement. I stepped just outside the door, under the diner's striped awning, close enough to the window that I could still see Mia gesturing animatedly at Olivia about something, and answered distractedly, still half-turned toward the glass. Grant asked whether I wanted to expedite a particular file, and mentioned it by the internal case number we'd used for years, Second Chance Case 0114, a number that meant absolutely nothing to anyone except the two of us. I said something back automatically, on autopilot, the specific phrase we'd used in every file review for nearly a decade, approve it the way we approved Hart's file back in year 1. No conditions, no name. I didn't think anything of saying it. I'd said some version of that sentence 100 times before, always safely inside my own workshop or kitchen, never once within earshot of anyone it could possibly mean anything to. What I hadn't accounted for was the diner's front door standing propped open behind me for the delivery driver who'd just come through with a stack of pastry boxes, or the specific, ordinary miracle of acoustics in a small town on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, or the fact that Olivia Hart, it turned out, had spent 9 years listening for exactly that phrase, no conditions, no name, because it was, nearly verbatim, the sentence from the letter she still carried in her wallet. When I came back inside, she was sitting very still, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately place. "Say that again," she said quietly, once Mia had gotten distracted by the pie case across the room. "What you just said outside, say it again." I asked her what she meant, buying myself a few useless seconds I didn't actually need because I already knew exactly what she'd heard. "No conditions, no name," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "That's not a common phrase, Ryan. That's the exact sentence from my letter, word for word, 9 years. And I have read that sentence probably 1,000 times." Whoa. I sat back down across from her, and for a long moment I said absolutely nothing, running through, one more time, the promise I'd made Claire on a hospital bed about never once letting a gift become a transaction that required my name. I thought about the version of myself that had built an entire quiet architecture around never being found out, the careful language, the stripped applications, 9 years of deliberate invisibility. And then I thought about the specific, deliberate irony of the universe placing this exact woman in this exact booth, on this exact rainy Tuesday, close enough to overhear the one sentence that could undo a decade of careful secrecy by pure accident. Some promises, I decided, sitting there with my daughter's half-eaten grilled cheese cooling between us, are worth keeping for their own sake. This particular one, I understood clearly for the first time, had only ever really been about protecting Claire's vision of quiet generosity, not about protecting myself, and Claire, more than anyone I've ever known, would have wanted Olivia to finally get her answer. "It was me," I said 9 years ago, the Second Chance Fund. "I read your application myself, at my kitchen table, about 6 months after I lost my wife." I reached into my jacket, pulled out my own wallet, and slid across the table the one thing I'd kept for 9 years specifically. Because Grant had once, half-joking, called it unnecessarily sentimental, a photocopy of the original handwritten essay Olivia had submitted, the version with her actual penmanship, instead of the typed formal application which I'd asked Grant to preserve. For me, on the single occasion in 9 years, I'd broken my own rule and requested to keep something beyond the standard file. Olivia stared at the photocopy for what felt like a full minute, one hand slowly coming up to cover her mouth, before she looked back up at me with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "You've had this the whole time," she said, not quite a question. "You knew who I was. You've known this whole time, and you never—" She stopped, shaking her head slightly, working through something. "Why? Why would you never take credit for something like this? Do you have any idea what those months were like for me? I was 3 weeks from dropping out entirely and moving back into my car. That letter didn't just help me. It's the reason heart wellness exists at all. It's the reason I exist honestly in any version of my life I actually wanted to be living. 9 years, she said again, quieter this time, mostly to herself. I built an entire company partly because I wanted to prove whoever it was right. Do you understand that? Every single hard decision, I used to ask myself what the person who believed in me with nothing would think of it. I told her, as simply and honestly as I could, about Claire, about the porch steps where she'd first described the fun to me, about the specific belief she'd held that gratitude, however well-intentioned, has a way of quietly indebting people, and that the purest thing she thought she could ever give someone was a chance with absolutely nothing attached to it, not even a name to feel obligated toward. I told her that reading her essay 9 years ago had, in its own strange way, helped me survive the worst year of my own life, because it gave me something concrete to do with grief that otherwise had nowhere to go. I told her, honestly, that I hadn't understood the full weight of any of it until this exact moment, and that some part of me suspected Claire had always understood it better than I did. What happened next is the part of this story I still have trouble fully explaining, even now, months later. Olivia went very quiet for a moment, staring down at the photocopy in her hands, and then told me something I genuinely hadn't expected, something that made the entire afternoon feel less like coincidence and more like the universe closing a much older loop than either of us had realized was still open. Years before the Second Chance Fund existed, back when Olivia was 16 and still in the foster system, a volunteer used to come by the group support center twice a month to help kids with college applications nobody at home was helping them fill out. Olivia remembered her clearly. A soft-spoken young woman, gentle in a way that felt entirely unforced, who once spent an entire Saturday afternoon helping her write a single financial aid essay and told her, before leaving that day, that she had exactly the kind of stubbornness that builds real things someday, once somebody finally gives it room to. Olivia had kept that sentence in her head for over 15 years. She told me, on the specific nights she needed it most. She'd never learned the volunteer's full name, just Claire. She had this way of not making you feel like a project, Olivia said, staring somewhere past my shoulder, clearly back in that memory. Most of the volunteers treated us like problems that needed fixing before we aged out. She treated me like someone whose plans just hadn't happened yet. I think about that session more than almost anything else from those years. Oh, I told her that sounded exactly like Claire, down to the specific phrasing, and that hearing it described so precisely, nearly a decade after losing her, felt like being handed back a small piece of my wife I hadn't known was still out there in the world. I don't know how to describe what it felt like, sitting in that diner booth, realizing that my late wife had, without either of us ever knowing it at the time, met Olivia Hart nearly a decade before I ever read her application. That some thread between the two of them had been quietly running underneath my entire adult life, long before I understood I was part of it too. Neither of us finished our coffee. Mia, still blissfully unaware of the full weight of what had just happened at her own lunch table, spent most of it explaining an elaborate and largely nonsensical theory about why dogs deserve their own diner menu, which turned out to be exactly the right amount of ordinary chaos to keep both Olivia and me from completely dissolving into the moment. At some point Olivia laughed, a real laugh, and reached over to steady Mia's tipping water glass with the easy reflex of someone who liked kids more than she'd probably had the chance to admit out loud in years. And I remember thinking, watching her do it, that whatever this afternoon turned out to mean for either of us going forward, it had already stopped being an accident somewhere along the way. In the weeks that followed, Olivia and I stayed in touch, first through careful, slightly awkward phone calls, then through visits that started needing less and less of an excuse to happen. She asked, gently and without any pressure, whether I'd ever consider letting the Second Chance Fund step, at least partially, out of the shadows, not to put my name on a building. Nothing Claire would have hated, but to let a small number of future recipients know, if they specifically asked, that a real person had made the decision to believe in them, the way she'd spent 9 years wishing she could have known. I thought about it for a long time before agreeing, mostly because I realized the goal had never actually been my own invisibility for its own sake. It had been protecting people from feeling indebted, and there were ways to preserve that feeling without insisting on total anonymity forever. Olivia, for her part, quietly restructured a portion of Heart Wellness's own charitable giving to run alongside the fund, doubling its reach within a year, driven, she told me more than once, by an almost desperate need to make sure some other 25-year-old, 3 weeks from giving up, got exactly the kind of chance she had. Mia adores her in the uncomplicated, total way 7-year-olds adore anyone who takes their dog menu theories seriously, and asks with increasing regularity when Olivia is coming back to Riverbend. On her 3rd visit, Olivia spent an entire Saturday afternoon helping Mia construct what Mia insisted on calling the world's greatest dog restaurant out of cardboard boxes and craft supplies, complete with a hand-lettered menu featuring items like Bacon Surprise and the Puppy Special, and I watched from the workshop doorway as a woman who ran a billion-dollar company debated, with total seriousness, whether a cardboard dog restaurant needed a drive-through window. I won't pretend I know exactly what Olivia and I are building yet, beyond a friendship that started with a completely random request to share a booth during a rainstorm and somehow turned out to have 9 quiet years of history behind it already. But I know we've had dinner 3 times now that had absolutely nothing to do with the fund, and I know that the last time she left, she asked, a little less carefully than the time before, whether I'd want to do it again properly. Sometime. No diner booth, no rain, no accidental eavesdropping required. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. I think about that Tuesday often, mostly because of how easily none of it could have happened at all. A different table open, a delivery driver arriving 30 seconds later, Grant calling an hour earlier or later, any one of a dozen small ordinary details shifting just slightly, and Olivia Hart walks back out of that diner still wondering, the way she had for 9 years, who had once believed in her before she'd proven anything to anyone. Instead, she asked a stranger if she could sit down, and the stranger turned out to already know the answer to the one question she'd spent nearly a decade trying to find. I don't think Claire would have called that an accident. Knowing her, I think she'd have called it exactly the kind of quiet, invisible thread she always believed in, the kind that finds its way back around eventually, whether or not anyone ever learns whose hands were holding it. Grant still handles every application exactly the way he always has, but these days, every so often, there's a small note in the file indicating a recipient has asked whether they can ever say thank you in person, and for the first time in 9 years, sometimes the answer is yes.